Good afternoon. My name is Oliver Schulze. I am a partner at Schulze+Grassov. We are an architecture and urban design firm, and I have the pleasure to be a moderator for the session today. So welcome all of you viewers out there, and I would like to invite you to be an active part of the discussion today, and we have three fantastic panelists for you. So I'd like to introduce you to Dorit Simonsen, Director and Chief Executive of the Hospice Djursland, an organization that is helping people in the last stages of their life to give them a dignified and meaningful existence. I'd also like to introduce you to Peter Barrett. Peter Barrett is Peter is based in the United Kingdom. He has taught at the University of Salford and also done research at the University of Oxford. And Peter is an expert in how school children and how people relate to learning environments. So we're going to ask Peter today more about his experience. Third person in the panel is Patrick Stremler. Patrick is a leading architect at the company Dietrich Untertrifaller Architekten. The company has offices in Austria, in Switzerland, in France, and in Germany. And Patrick has worked on many large-scale projects, but also on many award-winning buildings. So together, all of us today would like to think about, is user-centric architecture a good investment or not? And we will together deconstruct that sentence over the next hour and 15 minutes. And you are more than welcome to also chip into the discussion. So if you look on your screen right now, you will see a chat function, and over that chat function you can enter questions, and the team here at BLOXHUB is going to pass me your questions, and if they fit into the discussion, then I would happily pass them on to our panelists so we can integrate it into the discussion. But I would suggest we get started right away. I've been very much looking forward to this. The sentence, is user-centric architecture a good investment, made me think for a while. First I thought, what is user-centric architecture? Isn't all architecture user-centric? I thought that was the principle of architecture. But we will discuss today why that may or may not be the case, and we will relate that to investment. So we will try and make the bridge between what is user-centric architecture and investing in our built environment. So the first thing that I want to really call to your attention is that the United Nations has said that in 2019 the average life expectancy for people on planet Earth was 72.6 years, meaning we're born in spot A, that tends to be a building, and then over our course of our life we live in many homes, we work in many different places, we meet in different buildings. At some point we will be in a school or in a learning environment. Many of us will then work, and at the very end we often suffer from some sicknesses if we are unfortunate, and end in environments like hospices, or some of us do. So that journey takes us through a great many ranges of buildings. And some of them are natural to think about user-centric architecture, and some of them maybe we don't think so much about it. But I would very much like to have a discussion today about this very point in time, because if you look at the Architect's Journal today, then you'll see the headline of the Architect's Journal today is "The City of London looks to turn empty offices into homes." So buildings that were designed 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, in one of the world's leading financial districts to become Class A office space, the owner of those buildings is now looking at whether they can be converted into homes. So that for me just reminds me that actually it's quite difficult to plan for the future. And that really is something I would like to ask you, Patrick Stremler. Patrick, I've been wondering, at this moment in time, a lot of things are in flux. We're thinking our blueprint for life is sort of, the balls have been thrown into the air, and we're all waiting for how they land. We're going to live in different ways, we're going to work in different ways, we're going to build community in different ways. And you're at the forefront. You are a person that is actually building buildings, and you are planning bigger city districts. So I'd like to hear from you. Are the requirements for your projects changing at the moment? Do you see any trends you could share with us?
Yeah, Oliver, I think this is a very important discussion, because we thought that this user-centric idea was normal, yeah, but actually we are very, very lucky that during the last month or years it turned into a very important discussion in architecture. During the last decades, it was more the object in architecture that was important. So the creation of an object with proportions and colors and so on were more important than the question of how do we use this. This changes a lot. There is this COVID booster making us think of the qualities of our everyday environments, and the discussion is almost everywhere today. For architects and for everybody, you can switch on the television and people are dreaming of better life, of better cities, of better homes. And this is what we are facing at the moment. The brief for more recent city developments is asking more for mixed use. It's not really at the moment that people are asking for buildings that you can transform, but at least there is the question to not isolating office buildings on one spot of the city and homes at the other one, and governmental buildings and whatever you like. But the question is, how can you mix things to make this city be more user-friendly?
That's very interesting, Patrick. So in a way, we've gone through a century where planning and master planning has been trying to develop frozen visions of the future for large areas, and then in a phased way we build it out. And you're saying there is some evolution coming into that. People are starting to think less static and are accepting planning culture as a more dynamic process, allowing for change over time maybe, but certainly thinking of a new grain of the city, how living and working environments come together, if I get you right.
Yeah, right. But also, I mean, we are starting the discussion of what we do in the next life cycle. What will we do with our buildings? So can we transform those things? But this is still a bit of a way to go, because that's a very complex question of installations, MEP. We have to rethink buildings completely to make them last more than one life cycle. And this is, of course, very important, but it depends a lot on the way of investment. I mean, when an investor is only investing for the next 5 years and then intending to sell something, to sell the project, doesn't care too much. For somebody who holds it for a longer period of time, these questions become more and more important.
Very interesting, Patrick. Look, I will get back to you. I will want to hear more from you about some of the qualities that maybe are important for you to think about as an architect in the future, and also whether you have the right training as an architect, whether the architect is the right person placed to actually help in that process. But we'll get back to that. So I'd like to really take you to our next guest, and I would like to We've started out by saying that the average life expectancy on planet Earth is 72.6 years. And now we're going to do the journey from beginning to end. So we're going to start in school with Peter, and we're going to end at the end of life with Dorit in a moment. But Peter, I'd like to get a little bit into your background and your experience. You have published that there is a relationship between people that occupy space, students, for example, in schools, i.e. user-centric environments, and the way that they perform. You're making a correlation, if I understand, between well-designed space and the performance in space. You're saying the two are related. Do I catch that right in your research? Peter, I think you are...
Yeah, that's all right. I'm unmuted now. Yeah, that's exactly the relationship we were looking at. In fact, we were more interested in the general relationship between people and the built environment. And we were really quite obsessed originally with how the value of the built environment is released into society, and came to the conclusion that actually it had to be something to do with the experience of a person, a representative person in a space, and all of the inputs around them coming through their senses. And that could be the only way that you could experience the built environment, and that can be the only way, in a sense, that you get the value from it. So we decided to look at schools, partly because they're very important, and partly because you have measures of human performance, and the children in the schools in the UK, at least the younger children, tend to spend a whole year in one space. So it meant that if there was an impact, which we thought would be quite small, it should be as big as it can be in that space, and we should be able to get a measure of what that impact is in relation to learning, which is of course a very important human function in lots of different ways. So that's what we did. We looked at primary schools in the UK. We looked at the characteristics of each classroom space in physical terms. We looked at the statistics, the data that we could get on the progress of the children in relation to reading, writing and maths. And we did multi-level analysis to take out the effect of the individual children, the effect of the overall school, to see if the particular classroom really had an impact. And we were astonished that it explained the variations in the physical characteristics of the classrooms explained 16% of the variation in the learning progress of the children, which, when you think that 70% of it is explained by their individual characteristics, is a huge impact. And of course, we would see this as translating to people in offices, and they're doing their work there, using their brains. We're not really taking a user-centric approach. We'd say a human-centric approach. We're saying that buildings have to be conducive to humans functioning. And then, of course, there are some things that have to be tuned for particular activities. But in a sense, you probably know the expression where humans are sort of like social animals. Well, they're animals and they're social. And they have basic needs like oxygen, light, and so on. But they also have needs in terms of their social satisfaction and their ability to be happy and relaxed and interact with other people. And all of that needs to be addressed if they're going to reach their optimum level of, you could call it well-being, but you could also call it achievement. So, yeah, we were looking for that connection and we found it.
That's amazing. So look, let me just recap if I understood correct. You're saying that a human being, for example, a student in a learning environment, in a classroom, 70% of his or her performance is depending on the genetic background that we come with. It's given to us.
And social background.
And social background, okay. And the remaining 30%, half of that is actually dependent on the physical setting. 16%.
Yeah, and we think that's really surprising. We didn't expect it to be that big. It was published in one of the leading journals that looks at really, really hard science, which is heat, light, sound and air quality. And it was a prize paper in that journal for that year because it just shocked people so much. So it's very, very well evidenced. It's very well evidenced, but it's the truth.
It's the truth, and that makes me think when I look at school building programs, both in my home city here in Copenhagen, or school building programs in Manchester, very close to where you are, Peter. I see a lot of focus on how we can construct schools. How can we pool big sums of capital, not to build one school, but maybe to build 40 schools. And I see in those school building programs today a lot of evidence on construction, on efficiency in construction. I don't remember hearing much about the factors that you've just been talking about. Am I right?
You're right. It's a taken for granted thing, which is absolutely crazy. But educational buildings are very often built with learning not particularly in focus as a specific major factor that has to be addressed. And that is quite surprising, but I think it's because it's sort of so obvious that people overlook it. And then also the building is seen as an expensive container rather than an active force for good in that context. And so people aren't really thinking, can we make people learn better? They're thinking we're just providing four walls and that's all we need to do. And Patrick mentioned an interesting thing actually, and it was in your introduction as well, which was, are architects the best people to design school buildings? I actually think they are, and there are some brilliant architects around. But architects' brains, the neuroscientists know, work differently from ours. When they look at a building, when they look at plans, it's a different part of their brain that's working because they're highly trained and they see things in a much more conceptual way. Whereas users of spaces react in an intuitive way to a whole load of inputs, and they're actually experiencing a building in a way that is very hard for an architect to imagine because they've got so much history and concepts and ideas about what's being done that they actually perceive it quite differently. So there's a real need for close consultation with the users or the potential users of a building in order to reveal and understand what they actually really need and what they like and what you can provide for them.
And that I'd like to learn a little bit more about, Peter. So you're saying actually that the architect is a different animal. That's the first thing that I heard there. I'm also an architect, I should say.
I know.
But I'd love to hear a little bit more from you. So you're hinting at that this efficient box that we're building for learning, that there is some parameters that we as architects might not be trained to deliver by school training in architecture school. So I wonder if you can tell me a little bit more about your research. What did you find out? What is actually important then on the ground, in the classroom? What actually does make students perform better?
Okay, so we created a model which we sort of partly as a joke called the sin model. So we want sinful spaces, and the N of the sin is naturalness. We need healthy environments with good daylighting, good air quality, good acoustics, the right temperature and so on, because if those things aren't right, then you're not comfortable and you can't concentrate on your studies. You're not in the right conditions. We then added two others. So the S of the sin is the level of stimulation. This was a highly contested thing in the literature when we started. Should you have calm spaces that weren't distracting? Should you have exciting spaces that were stimulating? And our data very clearly showed that you need something somewhere in the middle, basically not boring and not chaotic and confusing. And this is the ambient environment. And so this is something the teachers do when they dress the classroom and so on. And it's very easy to make a space too cluttered and too busy. And then the third thing was individualization. And this is just the notion of people owning a space, it being their space. And we were looking for signs of this. So the work of the students on the wall, the names of the students on drawers and doors and things. And just the feeling that as you moved into the space, it wasn't just any old anonymous space, but it really was a place that was owned by the people who were in there. And those two second factors, this level of stimulation and the individualization, accounted for the same So 50% of the impact that we found as the naturalness things, which are the things that normally get measured because they're easy to measure. What's the temperature? What's the air quality? All those sorts of things. They've been measured for 200 years, but they only explain half of the impact. Those other things, which are quite soft factors, explain the other half. And they tend not to be factored in.
No, and they're difficult. We can have sensors for temperature. We can have sensors for CO2 levels. We can have sensors for humidity. What do we do about stimulation and individualization? We don't have computers, do we, that tell us about that?
We don't, but and this is actually something that architects are good at and human beings are good at, which is you just know when something feels right, once you know what it is you're looking for. So once we've given examples to teachers of, let's say, overstimulating or understimulating space or about right, and asked them to rate spaces and lots of images of spaces, they almost all get it spot on. And that's because once you've got the idea, it's not hard to see it. If you don't have the idea or the evidence behind it, then you're not even looking. You're not even thinking that it makes a difference. And similarly with the individualization, if I give you the negative extreme, if you walk into a white box of a classroom with grey furniture and very low colour carpet, say, and acoustic tiles on the ceiling, we've seen a few like that. You know it's an anonymous space. You know that it actually doesn't sort of feel very personal. Whereas if you walk into one where there's just a vibrant feel about it, there's the work of the children around, it's got a personality as a space, then it's a different thing. So it's sort of obvious once you know, but actually quite hard to measure scientifically.
Interesting. So Peter, it points a little bit at that you're saying that a learning environment similar to a home has actually some level of identification, that users can identify with the space and they feel it is theirs and it's tailored to them. That's somewhat counter to some of the trends in campus planning, for example, where we do more and more faculty neutral space that can be at 9 o'clock it's a psychology class, and at 10 o'clock it's an architecture class, and after lunch it's mechanical engineering. So there seems to be something there that we also need to be careful in our effort to make things more efficient and optimized, that we don't delete out the things that actually also can contribute to the brilliance that we can actually generate in those environments.
Yeah, that's very true. I've described students nowadays in university as being like refugees. They're wandering about, they don't belong anywhere, and it may be efficient, but I don't think it's effective, and I don't think it really creates a good learning environment.
I'd like to, after we speak to Dorit, we'll have another chat with Patrick about office environments, because I think workplaces definitely have a tendency to neutralize and to run counter to exactly that trend. So, but before that, I would say that both Patrick and to some extent Peter, you researcher, you apply that research in development projects throughout the world, I could read. Patrick, you're working on behalf of developers and investors, so in a way you're both spending other organizations' funds to build environments or to advise on the construction of the world. Dorit, you are actually a client. You have spent quite a number of years as the byggherre, as the client, actually helping to deliver environments where people spend the last part of their life. And it would very much interest me how only an evil person would say that a school is just an anonymous, efficient box, that it doesn't have more dimensions to it. It's easy to make an argument that we should invest into that environment. With your world, Dorit, it's a little bit more of a taboo. We don't talk much about death. We don't hear much about the places where people die. We don't draw those places in architecture school. So it's a little bit more of a hidden world for us. And I wonder, is there still focus on how people spend their last weeks and their last days? And in particular, your role as a client, what is your view on that phase in life and the role that architecture plays in it? Is architecture overrated or is it important?
I think that architecture is very important, but I will also tell you that a lot of architect students I think in the last few years in Denmark, really ask often to come here and would talk to me about what do we need to know about that so we can draw a good hospice where life's quality is very important. Could you please help us? So I think that some architect students are they are coming on it. I think so. But I think architecture is very important because, you know, the last where you spent the last end of your life, it's about life of quality, and you have to have your relatives here. You have to have the whole family here, so you need a lot of space, and they need to be comfort. They need to have palliative care, and my employers really need to have a nice place where they can do their work. So when you have a nice place, you also have a lot of life of quality here.
So Dorit, a little bit what you're telling me is that actually a hospice is not just a place with the user being the person that is leaving us shortly, but it's actually also a place of work where many people work, and they will spend many years there, hopefully, if they enjoy their work, and families will be here and they will be taking those memories away with them again. So you're saying we need to understand also hospices much more as all-round places that actually do make a sense. You do need to think about investing into thinking that through from a range of perspectives, not just one person.
No, not just one person. You know, we at the hospice here, when people come in, they are surprised that there are a lot of light here. There's you can see the nature. There's a lot of space because they expected to come here and it would be dark and it would be silent, and so when they come, they say, "Oh, is that a hospice? I'm in the right place." We have an old gentleman who said to me, when I'm finished here, could you please bring me to the room where I have to live? I say, but it's here. Oh, it's here. No, it's not here, he said. It's like heaven here. So he looked out at the windows, who are very big, with a lot of light coming in, and he could see the sea and he could see the nature. So he said, now, I would like to end my life here. It's okay. So I think it's important to think in colors, to think in lights, to think the view, the room had to be big enough so that the patient could be there, so that the workers can do their work. So it's very important. We have just built a hospice for children and young people, and then we ask ourselves who can help us. And we have a mother who have lost her young child at a hospice for adults. So we asked her, could you please help us? Because we have to build a children's hospice. And we found a young girl who has lived a lot of her life at the hospital because she was very ill. And we said, could you please help us? What's important for a hospice for children and young people? And then we made a lot of drawing, and we made a lot of writing, and we said we need a room for that, and room for that, a room for that. So we could give it to the architects. He said, could you build something? Could you draw a hospice like this? Because that's what we wanted. So I think that the user's voice is very important to hear when you have to build, like if it was a school or a hospice, it doesn't matter, but a lot of people are going to stay there for a long time, so it's very important that how they feel to be in these buildings.
Absolutely. No, and that's very, very interesting to hear, and also some very touching stories in a way. that give a completely different light of the environment that you're in, that I personally know very little about. Dorit, Patrick talked about the fact that his world is changing, that architects have to respond to more dynamic requests and understand planning as a more dynamic process that's not just about bricks and mortar. Peter has pointed at some soft issues, individualization and stimulation, to complement the more hard factors of humidity and temperature. I think you touched a bit on color and things, but could you help us a bit? Could you just repeat or maybe expand a little bit for you as a client, as a byggherre? What's the ecosystem that the architect operates in? So we understand, okay, you need to get the user perspective, but I know that you've also, you create as a client an ecosystem that's bigger, that also addresses, I think, art and other aspects in your process. Can you tell us a little bit more about not just the architecture process, but the whole ecosystem of the culture of planning your hospices and what's in that ecosystem?
Yeah. First of all, I think that the hospice has the place in the nature. Where is it placed? So when you look out at the windows, what are you looking at? It's very important. Then we thought how can we use the sun? Can we use the sun for this building? Can we make electricity? Because it's also important because we use a lot of water, we use a lot of electricity. So that the architects had to think of that also. And we also ask the architects to think about colors, because we know that colors is very important for people, and also for the choice of arts. There's a lot of studies who shows that arts is also important for people who is dying people, because you're lonely. It's a lonely process to die. And if you have to look at a white wall and no art, and the colors of the curtains are ugly, and you can hear a lot of noise from the other rooms, and the more lonely you can feel. So it's important to have a lot of the process around the person that you have to think about. So if you are in your bed and you have nausea and vomiting, what's about the smell from the kitchen? What about the smell from different rooms? So there's a lot of things to think about. And also you have to think about where can you be alone when you need it, or where can you go if you need to be with some other people. So I think it's complicated to build a hospice for to think of all these processes here.
All these spatial relationships and processes, and the support infrastructure for it, both technically and with people. I think that's great. Having spoken to all three of you, I'd like to come back to the headline from the Architects Journal today, saying that even the City of London, one of the world's leading financial districts, is thinking of changing space from grade A office space to becoming homes. We've now talked a while about very specific building types. Dorit, you've spoken about hospices. Peter, we've spoken about schools. I know you also have looked at other urban environments. But Patrick, you deliver living environments and you deliver working environments, offices. And much of our time in life, we are in buildings that are more, I don't know if generic is the right word, but they're not as specific building programs like a hospice or a school or a hospital. It's a home or it's an office. And it just makes me think, how much can we plan for that? How can we plan user-centric architecture and urban environments? Are we kidding ourselves that we can sort of identify users and that we can kind of tailor the world that surrounds them and that it'll be like that for the next 80 years? Headlines today seem to suggest otherwise. Patrick, I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, flexibility has always been important, and I think when you look at, I would like to have a look at this school typology. I mean, we have built a lot of schools during the last 20 years, and schools also have changed a lot. I mean, you had these classrooms with a corridor in the middle, and the children were sitting in this one room, hearing from the teacher, and then leaving the school after they have been faced to the teachers.
The fine German word Frontalunterricht. Yeah.
Yeah, Frontalunterricht, right. And today schools look so much different. I mean, they are like living or working environments where you have like glassed schoolrooms, you have then these flexible spaces in the middle, and they are very flexible. So everybody can learn how he wants to learn, yeah? So they get like their tasks for the week, and then they sit outside, they sit on the roof, they sit in the basement, wherever they like, and they can learn how they intend learning is the best way for them. And I think that has a lot to do with respect at the end of the day. So let people live, and also give them what they need. Because when we look at our schools, like in the very beginning, we started to replace these plaster walls with veneered, untreated surfaces. And we were faced to discussions where everybody said, oh, these children, they will destroy it right away. And it's much too expensive for that. And we see like these, like we have now one school that is 20 years old almost, and there is no scratch, no tag, no nothing. When you look at 20-year-old plasterboard schools, they are completely destroyed. So what is important to using the right material, to using the right space that respects everybody that lives in these buildings. And this is a very important discussion of this life cycle. How long does something last? Of course, you can build in plastic windows, but they, first thing, they don't last longer than any timber window. But on the other hand, they don't give the right environment to it is not respectful. You buy your bio tomato, you buy your bio gherkin, whatever, and you build environments with plaster boards and plastic surfaces that are maybe practical for the first step, but nothing else. And it's all about the respect of the way people live. And I want to put that really in the middle of this debate about user-centric. It's user respect at the very end. So what we need is these spaces that respect also the fact that people change their way of life. Yeah, I mean, you can't build anything and tell everybody, okay, you live as you have to live in this building. I mean, this building looks like this, and then be like the building, behave like the building. It's the other way around. And so what we need to do is to create structures that are flexible, that create different environments for different people. And yeah, right, respect the way people live.
Look, I think that makes a lot of sense, Patrick. I think respecting people, I like how you led it there, but there's also a little bit of a conflict to what Peter said. You described a world that is more flexible. You described a world where there's focus on materiality, spatial quality, but if I understood you right, it's also a little bit of a world where you do not have your personal corner so much. And I think that was a little bit in opposition to what Peter just told us a few moments ago about the fact that, Peter, if I understand you right, you do still see schools as somewhat cellular structures where kids and students can identify with a particular location, and they don't just roam from basement to roof and everywhere in between all day long.
It's as ever, it's more complicated than that, really. So I agree with the respect for people. I agree with the flexibility. I agree with the choice. All of those things should be built in, are very, very important. Then there's a slight complication, which is the schools we looked at were traditional schools. They tended to be cellular, which wasn't something we're saying they should be, but actually we strongly would say don't assume cellular is bad. And so actually, in respecting the users, what you have to do is respect the teaching profession as well, and their aspirations for different pedagogies and so on. And what Patrick described is what some people would advocate, and they're not wrong, but they're not the holders of the only truth. So there are other ways of teaching, and some teachers want to do it differently. And we found that with the Building Schools for the Future programme in the UK, where I think what he said shouldn't happen was tried, which was that they tried to create schools that would change the teaching profession with a vision for completely different approaches. And actually, it, to a great extent, caused a lot of problems. A lot of schools had to be changed quite radically after the first headmaster left after about a year or two, and the staff actually didn't find the space conducive. And so for me, you have to take, when you're looking at the user perspective, you have to really look at the user perspective, and you have to really respect their areas of expertise. And you don't have to assume that there's some, I don't know, right way of doing things which you know and the users perhaps don't understand yet. And so facilitating through flexibility and choice a whole range of possibilities, because if nothing else, buildings last for decades, and pedagogy and fashions in educational theory change more rapidly than that. The buildings need to be able to be supportive but adaptable as well. And for instance, a lot of very open plan schools have caused problems with lack of acoustic separation, and they've been found not to necessarily be more flexible, because actually having spaces which are related to each other that enable different activities to go on in conjunction with each other is actually often more flexible than having very big open spaces where it's hard to do that. So I'm just saying it's not simple. I'm not arguing for cellular or open plan, but I'm arguing for actually being open to the real needs of the children and the teachers who are trying to support their education.
And that I take very, very strongly. And that I take away from all three of you, actually, that a meaningful engagement of users, and that's really where I want to go with this discussion, is when I look at smart city or smart building research today, I'm always surprised how much energy they're spent on working out the exact right indoor climate. I can tell you in my home, I will open the window because I want fresh air. 30 seconds later, my wife closes the window because it's getting cold. A minute later, my daughter opens the window because the plants need some oxygen. Then we all go into my son's room and we fall over backwards because the air is so bad. So there is no Mr. or Mrs. Average that we often use as this kind of yardstick of the user. It's this abstract entity, and I think that I take away from all of you, that we need to find ways to connect with end users in a meaningful way. And Dorit, you've done that by speaking to children and grown-ups about the environment that they would ideally like to experience. Peter, I think you've done that in your research and where you apply this in various countries around the world. Patrick, you and I, when we go around the world planning new city districts, we often don't have that privilege. We often work at a scale. Today, city is not built by families building a urban building to construct their pension fund. Today, city is built by big organizations with lots of capital, chucking out 50,000 homes at a time, an island here, another island there, another city district there. And how do we engage the user in a meaningful way there so that we can call this user-centric architecture that is not just kind of taking a cut across Mr. and Mrs. Average? I don't have an answer, but I wonder, Patrick, have you thought about that? How do you engage users to create user-centric architecture when our cities are growing so fast that it's not just organically developing the neighboring plot? You have to speculate a little bit on the blueprint of the future, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, nobody can tell how life changes in the next years, and I think that this is important to know. So there's this flexibility factor in any case, but what we know is that there is a certain system of hierarchy of spaces that you find in every city plot in the world. In every city that have been built, there is always this in between most public and most private spaces, all these shades of public or privacy. And so this is something that I would say we know and that we have to keep in mind. And then there's this question of identity, which is something that is very important also. I mean, the question is the grainage of the city. How big is a building? How do you create spaces that are individual, so that an individual finds itself in this space and may call this home? I mean, when you look at all these buildings that have been built during the 70s, for example, like 100-meter long buildings and one after the other, children can't find their home anymore. And they will not identify anything as their home because there is nothing that you could call so. And so I think there are certain aspects that are very important. So the human factor and the question of how can you create identity that is something that we should push our clients to keep in mind, and not to calculate, not to take the calculation as the most serious item or the Excel sheet. I think there are many more questions to ask before.
Look, I think it's a super interesting subject. I think it's a super difficult challenge to start with. I think city building sort of happens by processes that are not always conducive to thinking too much about end users. But I do like how you're thinking about it, Patrick. I think all of us, are flexibility we're talking about being important, but we're also talking about user-centric specificity. Are those two mutually exclusive concepts, or can they go together? You know, is there a conflict between the wish to be flexible, to allow change in use over time, and to think very carefully about an end user, and risking creating a blueprint that's not adaptable? Or can you do those things together? Any of you understand where I'm trying to lead with that question? Or Peter?
I was beginning to jot some notes about exactly that, actually, because there is a contrast. They describe this in the UK in relation to bank managers. If you built a bank to suit a particular bank manager, they're always moving around, and so it would immediately be wrong for the next bank manager. And so the banks tend to create quite generic designs. But so I think the dimension you're raising is the timescale. In the short term, I think flexibility is about having options and choice and the capacity to own a space and make it your own. But in the long term, you're talking about adaptability. And I suppose in systems terms, you have to build in redundancy to that building. It's got to have a bit of over-design in it in order to be able to be knocked around and changed without falling down. And so I think there is this time dimension where flexibility plays out differently. And you need long-term flexibility in terms of that capacity to change quite radically. Yeah. And you need short-term flexibility for people to be able to adapt the space as they use it and give them choice. I don't think those are in contrast. I don't think they're in conflict, but I do think they're different things, both of which need to be addressed.
Both of which need to be addressed. And I think, Patrick, if I understand you right, you were thinking a little bit that a job of the architect is still to think that even constructing at that scale, people need to think not just generic, repetitive, but a part of your job is actually to think, how can you use the structure of public and private spaces to create a nuanced world where you find your pocket, and that is yours, yeah? That's how I understood you. I would wonder, Dorit, you're based in Djursland? Yeah? And I just wonder what you think when we talk about city development. BLOXHUB is a lot about creating a network of professionals just like we're in right now. And our city, Copenhagen here, is one of those cities that is growing with, I think, in the region of 20,000 inhabitants every year. So we do need to stamp new city districts out of the ground quite rapidly to be able to accommodate all the people that want to come here and that we want here. I just wonder, from your perspective, that is very sensitive, thinking about very emotional matters, very functional matters, both for the people that are your end clients, but also your staff. Have you been to Copenhagen and have you experienced recent development projects? Have you been to Ørstaden? Have you been to Nordhavn? I just wonder what goes through your head when you walk through those places?
I think, first of all, that money talks, because there's I think it's not good for the cities. I have been a lot of time in Copenhagen. It's a wonderful town. I live in Aalborg. It's also a small, big town, but it's the same there. I think it's when you go at the harbor, you see big houses and small flats. So I don't think it's good for people. I think we should stop it, but I think there's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of prestige in it, but I don't think it's good for people.
But to understand you right, you're saying that when you look at recent urban development, you feel a little bit it's like it's parking capital. It's building parking structures for capital, and it's not really thinking about the people that will hopefully occupy it.
It's not for life. No, it's not for people's life. No. That's what I think.
Look, that I think, I sympathize completely, and I can tell you that I work in London, amongst other cities, and over half the new apartments that are sold in London have never been seen by the person that buys that apartment. No. So a lot of development today, unfortunately, you can earn a lot more money with capital increases on private property than you can with what we're doing for our everyday jobs. So unfortunately, that kind of capital appreciation is something that is a part of the urban economics at the moment. And I think that that's part of the business at the moment, I would say. But I'm completely with you. I think cities are about much more than that. So I think we need to have a debate about how we can inject that level of humanity and thinking about the experience of places, buildings and open spaces into the city development agenda again, and make that the center document so that capital serves something not that we serve capital. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that sounds dangerously like I was thinking today as we're talking about plans. A kind of a system that had a lot of plans was socialism. 5-year plans here, 5-year plans there. And I think we're at a moment where we really need to think what plans are. I think Patrick and I think in architecture school we were taught that is a pretty static thing. A plan is something that is, as Peter says, our brains have been trained to look at them as orthographic projections of space frozen in time. And I think we need to rethink that model a little bit. I would just like to my support crew here. I haven't received any questions yet, so I wonder if any questions are coming in. I'm sure we have people out there that would love to ask you a few more questions, but while we wait for that, I just want to already first, Dorit, please comment.
Yeah, a comment because, this Hospice Djursland here was built 15 years ago. And, I still got visit from the architect because he just loved this building. He likes to be here. He's proud of the building. And I think you could ask the architects who built all those houses at the harbor if they also love their building or what. But I know when the architects come here after so many years and still loves to come here, it tells something about what architect means also for the architects. And a little story, when we opened 15 years ago, I think we have the open house for 2 days. And in these 2 days, there was about 5,000 people just to see how does a hospice look like. And they come in and a lot of time I heard, oh, is it really necessary to build a hospice as nice as this one when it's only for a short time of a person's life? And the only thing I said is, you ask why, and I said, why not? So if you have respect for people, I think we should see why shouldn't they have a nice place to live, even for many years, but also for a short time. So why not?
And that can affect the same thing. It's whether it's a hospice or whether it's the people's homes or workplaces. That respect should be the underpinning. Huh? Mm-hmm. So I've got the first questions coming in, but before I go to them, then I would say that in the spirit of this conversation, I would like to rephrase the question. Is user-centric architecture a good investment? ? I think we're getting to the place where we're saying, is user-centric architecture the basis of good city building, and how can investment enable it? So I think we need to get our priorities right here. So I think that maybe reflects a little bit some of our discussions to this point. Questions coming in, and you're also welcome to send your name and your organization so that the questions I field to Dorit, Peter and Patrick are a little bit more personal. The first question is, could you recommend any studies showing the impact of colors, nature, etc.? Let's drop etc. Let's just say colors and nature. Peter, you're firmly embedded in the academic world. You must have access to lots of research in those domains.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff written about that. A lot of it isn't evidence-based. A lot of it is based on preferences. But yeah, there's a lot of information, and I don't like to quote my own stuff, but what I'm giving you, or what I can ask you to give the people watching, is a link to a website where a lot of information about that type of thing has been collected together. And that's cleverclassroomsdesign.co.uk. It's freely available. The idea is that we hope people will see it. And we did a literature synthesis right towards the start. and gathered together a lot of exactly that sort of information. And in our own study, interestingly, the level of stimulation was linked to colour. Primary school children prefer, it seems, quite bright colours, but actually they're not best for learning. So you need a certain amount of brightness and liveliness in a space, but not an overbearing amount of it, I suppose. And so there's an interesting distinction between what's good functionally for something like learning and what's the preference of the people if you spoke to them. In terms of naturalness and links to nature and so on, there's some very famous studies about people getting better in hospitals with better links to nature. And we wanted that very much to come out strongly in our study. And it didn't come out in the main analysis, which was very annoying for us, but it's the facts. We have to go with the data. What it did come out for, though, was links to nature had quite a profound impact on writing as opposed to reading or maths. And writing is thought of as the most creative of the different subjects because you're inventing something in your mind. And when we talked to children later, they quite unprompted said they like to be able to look out the window and see trees and things when they're stopping to think, when they're actually trying to create something in the written form. And so these are very important factors. There's a lot of literature about it, and quite a bit of it is summarized as a way into it on that website.
And that website was cleverclassroomdesign.co.uk.
Clever Classroom, yeah. Sorry, it's Clever Classrooms Design with an S, design.co.uk, yeah.
Okay, I think we're putting it in the chat box, but anybody can get hold of that via us as well. So, and a small anecdote, I once worked on a campus in the United States, developing an extension of that campus and some new buildings. And in the briefing documentation for a new academic building was a study by the Brown School for Social Science at Washington University in St. Louis. And that study provided evidence that, that views into nature actually did enable restitution of learning ability to be accelerated. So effectively, the Vice Chancellor of the university was saying that investing into better connections to nature might help you create more Nobel Prize winners in time. So there is something there. The same study also said that animal petting rooms are a great thing to have, because apparently that also does help people, but those weren't implemented, I'm afraid to say. Let me just check. When I'm looking at my iPhone, it's not because I'm on somebody else's messages, it's because that's the way I get my messages from the technical assistants here. Could you recommend any studies about people's perception of space and buildings? I'm afraid, Peter, I'm looking your direction because you're most firmly embedded in the world of studies and publications. But I don't know, Patrick and Dorit, you hold up your hand if you want to show anything. I think Denmark has a wealth of literature that deal with how people perceive spaces. Dorit.
Yeah, yeah, because in Denmark we have an organization called REPA, and they have study a lot in architecture and palliative care. What does architecture means for palliative care? And then you can find something about colors, you can find something about rooms, and you can find something about natures and what it means, because I have asked a lot of people on the patient and the relatives. It's very important if you want to know something more about palliative care and architecture. And it's REPA, R-E-P-H-A, REPA.
So
architecture and
R-I-P-H-A. Was that right?
Yes, architecture and palliative care. Yeah.
So I think Helle and Pernilla are already checking that online, and we'll drop it into the chat box as well. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for that tip. I think we have about. Peter, you had a thought? I didn't see your hand there because I only see this part of your body.
Yeah, sorry. Perception of buildings. I do have something to say from our studies, and this was working with neuroscientists from the Salk Institute, and we asked them, how do you perceive buildings using your brain? And they very unhelpfully said, it's an ill-posed problem. Your brain is completely overwhelmed with sense information. And so what you actually do is, if you're not an architect, I mentioned that before, but if you're not an architect, it's an emotional response. You actually take everything into account, and without knowing why or how, your brain makes a calculation about, is this a healthy place? Is this a place I feel comfortable in? Is this a place that's doing what I want it to? If it's a theatre, is it exciting? If it's somewhere to go to sleep, is it calm? And you know how to do it as a user. And so the perception is very personal. It depends partly on your basic human needs, but it also depends on your experience of different spaces and your particular preferences. So it's really quite a complex thing. But the headline was that it's intuitive. It's really at the emotional level that we have our experience of spaces in practice.
Super interesting. We've got about 5-7 minutes left. So casting our mind a little bit over the discussion that we've had, I think from what I hear that there is actually a lot of knowledge about how we build user-centric architecture and how user-centric architecture can be a pillar supporting good urban development at scale as well. Doesn't seem to be knowledge that's holding us back. There seem to be a lot of studies. Often it's not necessarily translated, and the knowledge doesn't find its way into the built environment as it's constructed, sometimes at speed. In growing metropolitan areas at great speed, lots of things fall through the grid. I'd like to know from each one of you, from all three of you, if you now think back a little bit, and if we all had to accept now that our economy is structured in a way that big capital is what underpins urban development, and we would like to kind of add a human dimension to that, can you think of some cost-efficient, not to say the word cheap, ways of how we can create a more user-centric architecture and place? Are there cheap things that we could actually put down as a series of maybe 10 pointers, 3 from each of you and 1 from me, about things we would like to give as on the path of the people that are building city? So if I could start maybe with Patrick on the right, 3 things that you would inject into every planning and design process to create a more user-centric world.
I think at the end of the day, user-centric architecture does not necessarily need to be more expensive. It's just building the right way. And the question how we achieve that better quality is maybe more a question of how can we promote our idea? How can we create a certain wish to get a better space? And I think that all of us knowing or intending to know how the right way is need to spend some time like in educating and in showing good examples, showing our own examples, examples of others, and discussing this item that everybody understands how a good investment can turn out when it's thought with a certain degree of user friendliness or human.
So Patrick, that's one major takeaway. You're saying to me very much that we all need to be exposed and build a knowledge base. And while we don't all have the patience to read academic publications, all of us should see more good examples that have achieved these goals. And really, Patrick, what you're saying is we need to transform our planning and development culture. We actually need to not just churn things out. We need to have a more active dialogue and debate about how user-centric architecture can emerge at the small scale and at the large scale, yeah?
Yeah, right. I mean, the example of the building opening with 5,000 visitors, isn't that great? I mean, we have to show these examples, and that already helps a lot and costs nothing.
That exactly, absolutely. I just want to give the other two panelists also quickly an opportunity. Peter, if you could give some parting words on advice, what would your advice be?
Yeah, what a tricky thing. So you turn to the academics to think, where's the evidence? But the difficulty is that academics tend to be specialists. And so the papers tend to be quite finely focused on particular issues. And the people who are building need to take a whole load of things into account, which is where we need architects to synthesize all of that stuff. So in a way, we need some drivers for developers. I don't think there's a conflict between being user-centric and being a good investment. They should be lined up, but there's the evidence missing. The evidence is missing for the connection. If it was really, really clear, then people would want to create buildings that were going to be really, really good for users because they'd be very happy. The value of the property would be maintained. And so I don't think it wouldn't be difficult, but you need that evidence link and you need the information to come together in ways that are easy for people to act on. One of the issues we've talked about is flexibility, and flexibility at different levels over different time spans. And Patrick and you will probably know this, but DGW came up with a particular approach, and I've forgotten what it was. But it was a matter of having the really big things fixed, going right down to the scenery that you could change. And so actually building in flexibility at different levels in the design that nest within each other, so that in the short term you can change the colours and the disposition of the space quite easily. In the medium term you can change some other things like where the walls are quite easily. It might be quite difficult to change the overall size and position of the building, but actually thinking in those terms of different sorts of flexibility over time, I think would be something that it'd be worth reviving in people's consciousness. And then I would just say, sorry to go on, I would just say, if you haven't come across Stuart Brand's book, How Buildings Learn, the message in that is that if you don't build in flexibility, people will do it anyway. It'll just be harder. And so obviously building it in as a design aspiration has got to be a good thing.
Good thing, but we can even overcome structural issues and adapt them anyhow. That's human creativity. Peter, I think that very much goes in a similar direction, that we need to translate the evidence that exists into a digestible format for people that make quick decisions on the move that shape the world of the future. So I think that, Dorit, parting words from your side. Any advice you would like to give on the way here to the audience?
Yeah, I think it's very important that we work together. We work together, and we have to stay curious for what people want, because, you know, it's from the beginning of the life to the end of the life and the whole life. You have to have quality as good as you can. So better quality for life, working together. Yeah, and you have to think of the nature. What's good for the nature is good for you. So you have to work together with the architects, with the money men, and with the users, so we can go on with quality of life.
That's great feedback, Dorit. I think those are the things we don't tend to have a column or a row in the Excel spreadsheets when we make our fee proposals. We don't really have a column or a row for that dimension. So I think that needs to become part of the matrix, Dorit. And I thank you very much for putting it on the radar so clearly. So look, I think all three of you, and I would just back that up, advocating for a a rigorous look at our planning and development culture, that we think that dialogue with end users is absolutely central to creating user-centric architecture as the basis for good urban developments over time. And I think from our perspective, we would definitely hope that BLOXHUB and Realdania carry on supporting those perspectives here in Denmark. So we thank you very much, Patrick in Bonn, or Cologne actually by now, Peter in the UK, in the Peak District right now, and Dorit, I don't know if you're in Aalborg or in Djursland, but thank you very much as well. Yeah, so I would thank you, the audience, very much for checking in and being with us, for putting some questions our way along the way, and I hope that you took some important messages with you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.